Hi students, welcome to HSC Biology and Module 7, Infectious Disease. This is video number 27, and we're going to give you a very brief history of infectious disease. Now, the purpose of this particular video is that we're going to try and help to encourage you to evaluate historical, culturally diverse and current strategies to predict and control the spread of disease. Now, this is a big ask, so we want to make sure that we include the study of disease, which is epidemiology, and that's something that we'll have a brief look at in this video. We also want to see if we can use history to understand how the pattern of disease incidence over time may have changed, and also what sort of strategies have been successful in allowing us to do that, and then to go a little bit deeper, look at a couple of specific case studies to see exactly what we've learned and what sort of things are changing in the way that we currently deal with infectious disease. So we're moving now into an area called epidemiology, and epidemiology is the study of the incidence of disease in human populations. One of the things when we study epidemiology is we need lots of data. We need a large data source, and so this sort of information is being kept all the time. What it allows us to do is it allows us to identify patterns and causes of disease. For example, the amount of information that we gained in relation to, for example, the link between cigarette smoking and lung cancer eventually became so persuasive that there was nothing that the tobacco companies could do to counter the arguments. It was just too compelling. And so changes occurred not only in our legislation, in our laws, but also in our personal choices about what we were going to do in relation to cigarette smoking. We now know, people still have the freedom to choose, but now we have more information. We have more knowledge about exactly what's involved. And this has come from large data sets, lots of information, cross-referencing on things like demographic data, so demographics, also things like socioeconomic status or even behaviour, certain things that certain individuals do, and whether or not any of those are likely to be contributing to the incidence of particular diseases. One of the things with epidemiology is it's applied to both non-infectious as well as infectious diseases, as you can see from the example of lung cancer. And so it's enabled us to build a very big picture of a lot of the important factors that at least contribute to or may exacerbate different disease conditions. Sometimes it's about causation and sometimes it's about correlation. And these are two very important and yet very distinct terms. One suggests there is a relationship between them that is perhaps a direct cause and effect. Other is just that it's interesting that these two seem to have some sort of relationship to one another without necessarily one being the cause of the other. And so we'll look at, again, some examples of that. So when we start to look at the basis of statistical correlation, we can start to get a bit of a sense of whether or not this is just pure coincidence or whether causation is happening here. When we do find causation, of course, that means that we can maybe change some of our public health protocols, maybe look at preventative medicine. And as I say, sometimes this actually leads to changes in legislation. So it's actually governments changing the laws when they know that certain activities, certain behaviours, certain substances are a problem. So what are the keys to epidemiological studies? Well, first of all, they are longitudinal. So a longitudinal study is one that traces people or effects over time. So if we want to understand the patterns of disease, then we need to know what's happening over long periods of time, whether things that happen now can actually affect you some point in the future. Interesting things like mobile phone use. So one of those things, we just don't have enough time. We haven't really been using mobile phones long enough to see whether or not there is actually any change in the incidence of brain cancers, lack of fertility associated with where you've stored your phone, how often you've had it up to your head, and all of those sorts of things. There's still a new enough invention that we don't really have enough longitudinal data to look at that. We also need big big data. So big sample sizes are always important. The bigger, the better. Obviously, when you're surveying, if you ask everyone, you've got a complete survey. But that's often a very difficult and expensive and time-consuming task. So you need representative samples. But the bigger the sample, the better and the more reliable, the more confidence you can have in the conclusions that you make from the data that's been collected. As I mentioned, a lot of important demographic data is also collected. Sometimes age can have an effect on the incidence of certain diseases, sometimes your gender, sometimes your diet, sometimes your occupation, your lifestyle, your exercise habits. A whole range of different things can contribute either to increasing or reducing your chances of contracting particular diseases. We do try as much as possible to have control groups. These are cohort studies. Now, this is I guess the classic placebo, often carried out with double blinds, so that the medical professional doesn't know which of the patients is getting the treatment and which is getting a placebo. And then we can track each of the responses to see whether or not there's something about whether you think you're receiving assistance for something and whether or not you actually are. So each of these are collected again as part of our epidemiological studies. We look at incidence, we look at prevalence, we've explained those terms before. We look at mortality and morbidity rates, so looking at the levels of incidence in different groups. We also look at whether or not diseases are deadly, and the rates of diseases, of deaths associated with certain diseases can also be an important factor. And what we try and do is analyse the patterns and the trends. So this is what we're looking for. Is any of this data up here relevant to the disease that we're studying? Do any combination of these factors increase your likelihood? So when we talk about susceptibility of, say, older people to COVID, we talk about the fact that maybe within that particular demographic, there is some common factor that makes people in this age bracket more likely to suffer serious symptoms if they contract the disease. And hence maybe some of our decisions will be around trying to protect these people. Through all of these different things, what we're trying to do is develop management plans that either eliminate the disease, or if we can't eliminate it, then control it in some way, and constantly evaluating too the control and treatment programs. And this is why the data has to be big and longitudinal, so that when we are using intervention and when we are using some sort of management, we can monitor and see over time what difference that has made to the incidence of disease. And in the previous video, we were looking at malaria. That's one of the areas that we can look at to see what sort of impact intervention strategies have had on the incidence of the disease. So 2 little case studies that will get you to have a look at, and I'll just introduce those to you now, and we'll have a look at these a little bit more detail in class. The first is Dr. John Snow, not you know nothing John Snow, but a different John Snow. This John Snow is actually one who linked cholera, outbreaks of cholera, to contaminated drinking water. Now, one of the interesting things about John Snow is that at the time he did this, we didn't even have Koch's postulates. So we didn't know that there were little tiny organisms in the water that were causing the problem. He thought it may have been some sort of poison, toxin, something that was actually causing it. What he did do is, through a methodical process of elimination, found the exact place where the people who were getting sick, what they had in common. And what they had in common was this particular water pump that was located on Broad Street. And you can now see in the little photo in the background, you can actually go and visit this very site and see exactly what it was that, or where it was that John Snow made this very important discovery. One of the things he did find were over 500 cases within 10 days over a radius of about 250 yards centred on London's Broad Street. And as a consequence of that, he realised that there was actually a water pump that was being visited by all of these people, and therefore there must have been some contamination there. He didn't know what it was, but he did know that that was the source of all these people getting sick. How did he know that? Well, in a workhouse in a similar area that had its own private well, there were only 5 deaths among its 535 inmates. And when you are looking at the prevalence of a particular disease, when you see significant differences in the numbers, then maybe that's telling you something about levels of exposure, transmission, and all of those sorts of things. He also found a brewery on Broad Street never used water from the Broad Street pump, and its workers drank beer and had no cases amongst his 70 workers. Now, there's maybe more than one conclusion you could draw there, but one of the things that was very clear to John Snow was that it was this pump. It was something in the water in this pump on Broad Street that if you weren't using it, you were much less likely to contract cholera, but if you were, then your chances of contracting it were significantly higher. Now, we did this even not knowing that there's a particular bacteria called Vibrio cholerae, which has subsequently been found, that was causing cholera, but he knew there was something in the water that was a problem. Another interesting case study from the past, which has given us a little bit of, food for thought in the present, is a little closer to home here in Australia. Smallpox was one of those, and we've used pictures of that. They're very confronting. Smallpox, one of those horrible diseases, particularly of young people, but also of adults. And there were several smallpox outbreaks in the early European history in Australia. One of the most significant occurred in 1789. And one of the reasons that it did was because of the high number of illness and death amongst the Gadigal nation. And that was the group of Indigenous people who were living in this kind of Sydney area at the time of the settlement. The interesting thing about this, and we will have a look at this in classes, there's been a lot of ideas and suggestions as to exactly what was the cause of the outbreak, from accidental to more sinister or deliberate causes that maybe was one way of trying to help subdue the people who were the native owners and settlers of the land, certainly well before the arrival of the Europeans. One of the problems, of course, was that being on an island, being isolated, they'd had no previous exposure. And so therefore, amongst the Indigenous people, amongst the Gadigal people, there was no natural and acquired immunity to this disease. And so therefore, again, being a disease that was fairly virulent, it spread very quickly. Exposure of infected individuals for the purpose of care, part of the culture is to, and part of most cultures, I guess, when we're looking at this, is the care for unwell individuals. When people become sick, then people care for them. And of course, if you're not aware that the illness is being caused by some pathogen that's actually potentially going to be passed on to you, then you may not take the most appropriate precautions to protect yourself from contracting the same pathogen. And of course, that's one of the things that happened as well. The Indigenous people also didn't have access, and back in 1789, the population at large didn't have the same sort of access to hygiene, to sanitation, to good medical practice, to good disposal of biological materials or anything that had been used to help with the treatment of the sick. There was no isolation or quarantine measures put in place to keep the infected individuals away from healthy individuals. And even some of the cultural practices like the burial practices could have helped to transmit the pathogen from one host to another. Of course, one of the important things about the Indigenous people is there are many nations, and they had a lot of internation trade and other interactions, and this would have brought people into contact with other groups and potentially passed the pathogen on. This is one of the interesting stories around infectious disease, and also a little bit of a concerning one too. But I want you to have a look at that in class, gather some material and see if we can find out exactly what happened in this particular case, or at least what evidence there was for this particularly serious outbreak amongst the Gadigal nation. Look, thanks for hanging in there. Again, another one of these quite long videos, but there's lots of information and a few little ideas that we presented there, so you can take them and run with them in class in your case studies. Thanks for watching.